CERB is finished, but the pandemic rages on. You want to work, but if your work is still closed, how will you pay your rent? Let's explore the short-term and long-term implications of government support, starting right now.
This is Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
Let's get started. Who are you and what do you do?
Sure. My name is David Macdonald. I'm an economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And so it's a think tank here in Ottawa, that we do have some provincial offices as well. And I follow federal government policy, in this case, been following the income transfers to Canadians very closely, including CERB. And so hopefully we'll get into that in a bit more detail today.
Oh, we will. So David, thank you very much for being here. And this is show number 319. You were a guest way back on show number 114, which aired November 5th, 2016. So about 4 years ago. So obviously you did a great job or else we wouldn't have asked you back. And back on that show, we talked about basic income and whether or not it was the silver bullet to deal with poverty. I'll put a link to that show in the show notes. That subject may come up again today. But first, I do want to talk about CERB and EI and what's happening with all the various federal government support programs. And I want to emphasize to everybody that the purpose of this show is to present ideas. I'm not here to promote any specific idea. I'm not here to say the government should spend more money or less money. I'm not an expert on that. That's why we've got you here. What I do know is that my clients, people who go bankrupt or file a consumer proposal, have a debt problem, obviously, but even more than that, they have an income problem. Last year, before the pandemic, people with increasingly higher incomes were filing insolvency, and that's because their living costs were increasing. Housing, food, transportation, everything was going up, and it was going up faster than their income, so that's an income problem. Then, of course, the lockdown started, and some people, completely lost their income. If you worked at a restaurant or a health club or a hair salon, your employment income immediately went to zero. So the first thing the federal government did was create CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. So, David, maybe we can start off with a bit of history. What was CERB? How did it work? What did you need to qualify? How much money were you getting paid?
Yeah, so let's go back to March 15th. This was when the shutdown initially started. Initially we thought it was going to be for a week or two after March break. Turns out it lasted a bit longer, at the 6-month mark at this point. And so as the shutdown started to proceed across the country, as we saw province after province just mass shutting down sectors and people being totally tossed out of work as a result, the unemployment system, which is built on computers from the 1970s, crashed and burned because it just couldn't take the flood of applications. And so it was replaced on the fly with a totally new program that was called the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, or CERB, the acronym. And so it took over the EI system. So if you applied to EI because you lost your job, you might have thought you were applying for EI on March 15th, but you weren't. Turns out you were applying for CERB. And everyone after that point, you couldn't apply for regular benefits. EI was shut down for people who'd lost their jobs and were looking for support. The CERB system paid you $500 a week. You could get it through one of two sources. You could get it on the CRA website, where you get it in $2,000 chunks, or you could get it on the ESDC website where you apply for EI. There you get it in $1,000 chunks every 2 weeks. And in essence, it was an attestation basis. So in contrast to EI, where you got to jump through all these hoops and all your paperwork has to be in order and you got to wait a week and all that, the CERB didn't work like that. You checked off a box that said that you were eligible. Now, what made you eligible was that you had made at least $5,000 in the previous 12 months or the previous year, and you, in essence, had your job in some way impacted by COVID-19. It was much more expansive than the EI system was, in that it covered not only people who had regular employment, but also people who were self-employed, who would never have been covered by EI in the sort of previous system. It also covered people who might not have been eligible for EI because they didn't rack up enough hours, even if they were paying into it, which was a common situation for a lot of people. And so, in essence, it was a wholesale replacement of EI on the fly at the very start of the pandemic, and it has lasted through till just the end of last week. Actually, was when, in essence, if you're on it full time since the start, it would have ended, and then you would have potentially transferred to a new set of programs, including EI, but some new Canada Recovery programs.
And that's what I want to talk about. So we are recording this on Wednesday, October the 7th. the week before Canadian Thanksgiving. So if you're watching this show in the future, well, I'm sure the rules are totally different than what's happened. But as I understand it, CERB has been replaced with 4 different programs. You mentioned EI, so that's number 1. There's the CRB, the Canada Recovery Benefit, the CRSB, the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit, and the CRCB, the Canada Recovery Caregiving Benefit. So let's start with employment insurance. And you already made the point that it's based on computers that were built in the 1970s. So that kind of tells you something right there. So so I was on CERB. CERB is now over, but I'm not back to work yet. What do I need to do to qualify to get EI, either the new EI or the old EI or whatever EI is now?
Yeah, so there's about 4 million Canadians receiving the CERB at present. That's been fairly stable for August and through September at around 3.5 to 4 million, depending on which particular period. And that's roughly the number of people who are going to transition off of CERB onto something else. About half of the people that are presently receiving CERB, or about 2 million people, are EI eligible. So that is to say, they paid into EI before they lost their jobs, and therefore they're eligible to collect from EI. Now, there's been a couple of very important changes to EI that have happened prior to this switch over back to it. The first was a huge reduction in the number of hours required to get in the door. So prior to the pandemic, in most big cities in Canada, you had to have worked at least 700 hours to get into the EI system in the previous 12 months. That's been substantially reduced to only 120 hours. So just a couple weeks worth of work at any point in the last 12 months would get you into the EI system. The other big change is that the floor on EI has been, well, there is a floor on EI. There was never a floor on EI prior to the pandemic. It was always you got 55% of your previous earnings. If you didn't really make very much, you got 55% of not very much, which could be even less, obviously. And so there's a new floor on EI benefits at $500 a week, which is, again, the exact same as what you would have gotten on CERB. There are definitely about 700,000 people who will make more switching into the EI system because the cap on EI is $573 a week. So there are people who are going to be better off because EI has restarted. But for the folks and this is where it gets a bit complicated, is if you were getting EI through the CRA website, through the tax website, if you were getting CERB rather, through the tax website, through the CRA website, and there's about 750,000 Canadians who access CERB through the CRA website, you will not be ported automatically to the EI system. So you're going to have to go to the EI website, you can do that right now, and apply for EI. If you applied for CERB through the EI website originally, and you were getting it in $1,000 increments every 2 weeks, then your claim should be ported automatically because you're sort of already on the EI website side of things. However, again, if you're receiving your CERB in $2,000 increments every month, you're going to need to go and apply. And if you don't apply, you're going to get nothing. Like, you're not going to be ported across automatically.
So there's obviously some work that some people have to do. So I could get $573 as opposed to the $500. Explain about tax withholdings at source and contrast CERB and EI for me, please.
So CERB actually got a special exemption that allowed it to not deduct taxes at source, which was very unusual, but the issue was they wanted to get the money out the door as quickly as possible. And so the legislation actually made it such that you do owe taxes on CERB. It's just that none of it was withdrawn at source. So for anybody who received CERB, hopefully you've got a bit of that money stashed away, maybe 10 or 20%, because you're going to owe tax on that come tax time in March of 2021. Now, all of these new programs do deduct income taxes at source. Now, EI always deducted income taxes at source, so nothing new there. It will continue to do that. And the new CR programs, of which there are 3, will also all deduct income taxes at source. They're deducting 10% of the value that you receive at source. So what that means is that instead of receiving $500 a week in your account, you'll receive $450 a week in your account. The upside of that is that you are going to owe less. I mean, it depends on your circumstances, but you're going to owe less tax at tax time because some has been withheld at source. And so that is one of the things people are going to have to expect, is that you're going to receive a little bit less on a weekly basis. However, you're not going to owe that money later at tax time.
Yeah, so if I was getting $2,000 a month on CERB, I'm now getting $1,800 a month?
That's right.
Am I
That's
doing
right.
the math in my head? That was pretty
Yep.
good there. I did 10% in my head. But you're right. What that's doing is taking some tax off, but next year at the end of 2019, so let's say March of 2020, you file your taxes, you include all your income for the year, which is what determines your marginal tax bracket. And if you happen to be in the 30% bracket, maybe because you made a lot of money before the lockdown and then a lot of money after, which pushes you into a higher tax bracket, or maybe you cashed in RSPs or did something else to increase your income, you could end up owing 30% tax on the CERB benefits you received, and you paid no tax on it. So you could be hit with a decent sized tax bill next year is the risk, right?
That's absolutely right. So, I mean, people need to be prepared that CERB is taxable. And so if you made a lot of money before getting laid off or think you'll make a lot of money in the rest of the year, you're going to owe taxes on that. And it could be, as you say, I mean, it depends on your marginal tax rate, but it could be 30%, say. If you didn't make a lot this year, then
probably not a big deal.
Tax, but it'll be less, obviously.
What is the maximum somebody could have received on CERB? Is it $12,000?
Yeah, I think so.
Because it was roughly 6 months, I think, is how the math worked.
But you don't quite have 4 weeks in a month. It's 4.3 weeks in a month. Anyway, I'd have to look, but it's roughly that amount.
Something in that ballpark. So yeah, if you happen to be in the 30% tax bracket, well, then that's $3,600 of taxes you're going to owe that you weren't aware of. Now, if CERB was the only income you had in 2019, then you're probably below the threshold and you're not going to owe hardly anything in tax. So that's something I agree people should be thinking ahead. Do you think, and you don't have to answer this question if you don't want to, you can just pass on it. We'll edit it out of the transcript at the end, but what do you think the chances are that the government says, wait a minute, there were 8 million people who received CERB. I think my numbers are roughly accurate there over the life of the program. So that's 8 million people who will have a higher tax liability than they would have otherwise had. That's potentially a massive number. Do you think there is a chance the government either says, you know what, we're going to not make you pay it, or we're going to put in some special rule where everybody gets a year to pay their taxes next year without interest? Do you think some accommodation is possible?
I think it's pretty possible. I mean, when you think of the number of people now approaching 9 million Canadians who received a payment from CERB at some point since March, not to say they were on it the entire time, that's almost 45% of every working person in Canada, received the CERB at some point since March, just to give you some idea of scale. It's just an incredible amount of Canadians who received the CERB at some point. I mean, even at 4 million people receiving the CERB right now, as it ended at the end of September, that's 10 times more people than were receiving unemployment insurance in February prior to the pandemic. So it's really a tremendous number of people who are going to likely owe tax on this CERB amount. I think it's possible that CERB would be reprofiled in that, maybe you're not going to owe the money, you're not going to owe tax on it if you didn't make a lot. Maybe there's a different regime that applies to that than say the tax rates that would apply to earned income. I think that's very possible. Just because I think there'll be a big uproar when people get a big tax bill. I mean, the real danger here, of course, is that you end up with low-income folks who didn't really make a lot to begin with. They're receiving critical programs like the Canada Child Benefit that are keeping them out of poverty. They're working a bit, they got the CCB, so they're staying out of poverty. They get hammered with this big tax bill, and the way CRA collects money is it deducts it from your other payments. And so all of a sudden you're receiving these critical CCB payments, and you're not receiving them anymore because CRA is garnishing them back until you're all paid up, in essence.
And CCB is the
Canada Child Benefit. So this
is what we used to call the baby bonus or the child tax credit. It's now called the CCB, the Canada Child Benefit. And so if I end up owing $2,000 in taxes and I'm getting the $500 CCB every month, it is theoretically possible that for 4 months I might not get it. I don't think they'd be quite that heavy-handed, probably. Maybe they take half of it or something, or 20% of it or whatever, but that's also a risk. So and we've had some discussions with CRA representatives just, on the phone because I'm talking to them all the time. And at the moment, they're all saying, we don't really know exactly what line on the tax form this is even going on. We're not at that point yet. We're still working on it. So it's too early to say what might happen. But so you think it is possible, though, that there will be some kind of special accommodation. We have no idea what it will be, But I mean, off the top of my head, the obvious one would be, okay, you get longer to pay it back. Can you think of any other special accommodations they could make? Because I don't see how they can say, yeah, you know what, we're just not even going to make it taxable, because then everybody who didn't receive it says, wait a minute, I went to work during the pandemic and I had to pay tax, and they don't. So you got a political issue here too, don't you?
Yeah, so I mean, the other thing you could do is you could make it not count as earned income, but count as a different type of income with a different scale of taxation, such that if you're below a certain income level, you don't have to pay tax on it, over the course of the year. But as your income rises over the course of the year, then, it's included at a different rate. You could do something like that. I mean, there's different ways of doing it, but I think it will become a very live issue in the spring. So, I mean, I wouldn't gamble. If you receive the CERB and you have a savings account, like, don't use that savings account to go buy a TV. But, I think it is possible that there would be some accommodation there.
Don't buy a TV with your CERB. There you go. There's some practical advice for you. So, well, and it's interesting because last week's podcast, we talked about the complexities of the tax system, and in order to make it fair, you kind of need to make it complex. And what you're introducing is, well, in order to make this fair, maybe we do have to put some complexity in for this particular type of income. So I guess, let's wait and see. The government obviously has had to worry about getting the thing up and running, and they'll figure out how the rest of that works. And obviously the political landscape will probably have some impact on it. Now, you did mention that there are really 4 programs. So we talked about EI. And with EI, you have to actually qualify. They've lowered the number of hours you needed to have worked to qualify quite a bit, but you still have to have had some employment income in the past 12 months in order to qualify. CERB is now gone. It ended at the end of September, I think you said. So there are now 3 new programs in addition to this modified EI. So the first one I would like you to explain to me is CRB, so not CERB, but CRB, the Canada Recovery Benefit. What is that? How does it work?
Yeah, this is primarily to extend coverage to self-employed and gig workers. So these folks were included in CERB, and it's quite similar to CERB for those people who fall into that self-employed and gig category, in that it's the exact same amount, $500 a week, although you'll only get $450 because taxes are being withheld. Same criteria, you had to have made $5,000 either in 2020 or in 2019 or in the last 12 months. So you had to have made some money in the last little while. Now, there's a new wrinkle to the CRB, which is that if you make over $38,000 in 2020, they're going to claw it back at 50 cents on the dollar, which is, a pretty severe clawback. And so if you made a lot of money prior to losing your work, and you lose at least 50% of your work, that's the requirement for the CRB. So you can still be working a bit and receive the CRB, but it has to have been at least 50%. You may get caught. I mean, it's about 70,000 people who will get caught by that $38,000 threshold. That will make more than that likely in 2020, and so as a result, probably won't apply to the CRB. Excuse me. But for other people, it's attestation based, and so it's like the CERB. You go to the CR website, you check a box, it says you're eligible, and they sort of check the paperwork later. And this is in contrast to EI. I mean, EI is, the people going back to EI, it is, I guess the application process is somewhat simpler, but it's still not attestation based. And so if you don't have the right paperwork in place, you will not get the benefit, which is, different from the CRB, where it is attestation based. So they're just going to check after the fact.
How is that going to work in real life then? So you're saying if I make more than $38,000 in all of 2020, then I get clawed back 50% for every dollar I'm receiving over that.
Yeah.
But I don't know how much I'm going to make in 2020 yet because it's October. So maybe I'll make a lot of money in November and December. Maybe I won't. Is this going to get clawed back when I file my taxes next year?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it's for the entirety of the 2020 tax year. And so if you're a high-priced consultant and you lost work and you've been on the CERB and the CRB, and then you get a big contract next month, then yes, you'll potentially owe 50 cents on the dollar of the CRB back. It'll be clawed back.
So it sounds like there's a couple of different landmines that have been put into the ground. You got CERB, where you might end up owing some taxes. Then you've got some CRB, where you might end up owing a very significant amount. You might have to pay back 50% of it. depending on how the rest of the year goes. So now maybe that's an unlikely scenario, because if you're getting the CRB in October or November, there's not a whole lot of year left to be earning money. But again, something to be aware of. There is a tax implication to this.
And there's also a big difference between whether you're getting, so there's, if you're working a little bit, you can also still receive EI. EI has a sub-program called Working While on Claim, and it allows you to receive EI benefits while you are working a bit. So, if you go back to your regular hours, you can't get EI anymore. But the way the Working While on Claim program for EI works is that it also claws back 50 cents on the dollar, but it does it immediately. Like, it doesn't wait for you to make $38,000. It claws it back immediately. So for every dollar that you make in earned income, they pull 50 cents out of the EI payment that you get. And this is different from the CRB. The CRB doesn't claw back immediately. It only claws back once you make $38,000 in 2020. So big difference on the clawback rates and when they kick in. EI is much more aggressive than the CRB. The CRB lets you make a lot more before it starts to claw back.
But then you end up paying for it at the back end. So, okay, so that's very important to understand. Is it possible to be getting EI and CRB at the same time? It's one or the other.
There should be no overlap between any of these programs. So if you end up on both, you should definitely pay it back. Yeah,
you're getting one or the other. Okay, so program number 3 is called CRSB, which stands for Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit. Explain that one to me, please.
Yeah, so in contrast to the other programs, which are much longer term, so the other CR programs are 26 weeks, EI is at least 26 weeks, you can extend further than that. The CRSB is very short, it's 2 weeks. So you're allowed 2 weeks off of sick leave due to COVID-19. It's not sick leave due to something else, but sick leave due to COVID-19 if your employer isn't providing it for whatever reason. And it pays $500 a week, but you do have to be either yourself sick with COVID-19, quarantined due to COVID-19, and therefore you can't work, and you've seen a work reduction of 60% in the week that you're applying for, but you can only apply for it twice. So, don't be quarantined more than 2 weeks in the year, because you don't get another shot at that third week, you would get nothing.
And if I'm reading my notes correctly here, the applications for the CRB open October 12th. So that's just after Thanksgiving, whereas the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit, the application period is now open. Is that correct?
I think that's right, yeah.
So, okay, so the CRSB, the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit, is 2 weeks, that's it. And so obviously there's not going to be millions of people probably applying for that one. What is the fourth one? CRCB, the Canada Recovery Caregiving Benefit.
So this is if you are taking time off from work because you're taking care of children, which is going to be the primary reason, or you're a caregiver for someone else. So you're forced to take time off because your kid can't go to school because the school's closed, or they had to quarantine, or that class is closed, your child care is closed. It's anybody whose kid is out of school or daycare under the age of 12. This would have been a very big issue in several provinces prior to rule changes that happened. Basically, if you had a runny nose in Ontario, your kid couldn't go to school or daycare. And you'd be out for a week waiting for a test to come back. So that's what would, in essence, qualify you for this CRCB. It's $500 a week as well. It's attestation basis. So you go to the website, check a box sort of thing that says you're eligible. It certainly, as more, as we see upticks in childcare and school settings, we've seen a bit, but as we see more closures, this will be more useful to people in the sense that it's a quick way to receive, at least a bit of money if you're forced to take the entire week off. Now, of course, if you're paid by your employer through some program through them, then again, you can't apply for this. You have to be legitimately without income, or have seen a big 60% drop in your income due to this. But hopefully it'll be a useful means for people who have to stay home with kids.
Now, you've raised the issue of employers. So what if I have to go to work, my employer's making me, or what if my employer says, look, work is slow, I only need you to come in for a day or two a week. That's all the work I've got, or maybe I only need you to come in for 3 or 4 hours a day. what am I as a worker supposed to do? Because there are thresholds to all these things. So if I work just enough, if I understand correctly, I'm not going to qualify for certain of these programs. So is there some kind of limit as an employee? I'm going, oh boy, if I work 1 day a week, I'm okay. But if I work 2 days a week, I'm not. Is there any way to think that through?
I mean, these systems are better than CERB, because CERB, if you made more than $1,000, if you made more than $250 a week or $1,000 a month, you made $1 more, you got nothing. But if you made $1 less, you got the full amount. The new programs aren't like that. They don't have the same kind of hard thresholds on a sort of weekly basis. So for EI's working while on claim program, so one of the wrinkles with working while on claim is you have to have been fully unemployed for a week, and then you can get access to working while on claim. If your employer just says, you were working 40 hours a week, business is still really slow, I'm going to cut you down to 20 hours a week, that doesn't make you eligible for working while on claim under the present rules. It may be that those rules will change, but at present you have to be fully unemployed for a week, and then you can get working while on claim. In that situation where, let's say, your employer, wants you to get some support, so they lay you off for that full week, you qualify for EI, and then they bring you back, say, half-time, then you would qualify for EI's working while on claim. You would claw back 50 cents in the dollar, but you would get some money from EI, some money from your employer, and so you'd be sort of, you'd be topped up in essence to some degree on the EI program. So there isn't a threshold like that as there was for CERB. On the other side, if you say to your employer, look, my kid's at home, I got to stay home with my kid, and your employer says, well, that's tough, I need you here. You can quit if you want, but I need you here for this shift, and you're forced to quit because you got to stay home with your kid. In that case, you can still apply to the CRCB, the caregiving benefit. So that it is one of the loopholes. I mean, under the old EI system, you couldn't quit really for any reason and still get EI. In this case, you can quit and still receive the CRCB.
So really what you have to do is on a piece of paper, write down the 4 things we talked about: EI, yeah. CRB, CRSB, CRCB. And fortunately, you've explained it all, so people can take notes on what you've talked about and understand under what things I qualify for. And then it's basically, okay, I got to pick the right one and understand what's available to me and then apply accordingly. Now, you have, you write a bunch of stuff. There's a website called behindthenumbers.ca, which I believe is, you are a major contributor to. And you wrote an article at the end of September. Again, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And you said that, there are, a couple of million people eligible for EI, 500,000 for CRB, 181,000 for CRCB, CRSB will be a very small number. And then you said 776,000 CRB recipients, CERB recipients, will receive no further federal support once CERB ends. So who are we talking about there that was getting CERB and now won't be getting anything?
Yeah, the biggest group, I mean, there's three categories there. The biggest group is people who didn't make very much, didn't have a lot of hours. They were either regularly employed, so they paid into EI, or they were self-employed. You think of like an Uber driver or something like that. They lost some work at the start of the pandemic, and then they got their previous sort of hours or earnings back. So, but they were still making under $250 a week. So in that case, they would have actually qualified for CERB. They weren't hitting the CERB threshold. They had lost work due to COVID-19. And so they would have made the CERB threshold. And so in essence, CERB for them acted like as a support, an employment support. They were working, but CERB was still supporting them. That's the biggest portion of that. 750,000 people is that group. The other two groups, which are much smaller, is the people who hit the $38,000 threshold. So these people who made too much in 2020, and so they'll get clawed out of they'll see the big clawback and probably won't apply for the CRB. And then there's another group of people who would technically qualify for working while on claim, but they'll only get under $50 a month, under $50 a week, from working while on claim. So it's not really a lot of money a week, and it's unlikely they'd go through the hoops to apply. And so they would technically get some money out of the program, but they probably just won't apply. And so for them, I mean, they'll also receive no support. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. I mean, given the big difference between how CRB recipients are treated when they're working versus how EI people are treated while they're working, you could actually create a bit more generous working while on claim program where you do set a lower, like you set a lower bound. So instead of making, $3 working while on claim, you get at least $75 or at least $50 a week. And there are some historical precedents for that. There are some previous working while on claim versions that had criteria like that, where you'd make $50 or $75 a week. But at present, that's not what's happened. So, some people will just say, I'm just not going to make very much from this working while on claim. I just won't apply.
So let me ask you the big picture question then, which is, so what do you think of all this? And I understand the government had to cobble this together very quickly, and they had to use old technology and all the rest of it. But, overall, what do you see as maybe some of the shortcomings in what we have now? So let's ignore CERB because it's over. What do you see as some of the shortcomings that we have now that you would like to see addressed?
I think one of the biggest, the programs themselves have been created, I think these are positive changes to supporting employed people in Canada. The expansion to self-employed workers is extremely important as we move more towards gig work, particularly in big cities. The lowering of entrance requirements is going to make a big difference to people that are insecurely employed. It's going to make it a lot easier to access the system. And the floor on benefits for EI is also going to make it much better for people that just don't make very much. And the 55% of your previous earnings was extremely little. And so people sometimes just wouldn't even apply for EI because it wasn't worthwhile based, if you're making minimum wage. So I think those changes are positive, and they're also longer term. So despite the fact that they remain relatively temporary, they're a lot less temporary than CERB was at the end. It was extended, on a month-by-month basis, and that's not really something you can plan on. I think one of the big challenges, though, with these new programs is they don't provide the same level of benefits depending on your circumstances. And that's particularly true if you're working a little bit. So if you're working a little bit, you really want to be in the CRB. Self-employed people are treated much better than regularly employed people. If you're working a little bit through EI's working while on claim, the clawback is just much more severe. And so trying to rectify those differences between the programs, I think will be an important thing going forward. And then trying to integrate them into a longer-term EI system that works for self-employed people, gig workers, and also works for regularly employed people, particularly lower-income regularly employed people. I think that's going to be one of the challenges. How do we, we're slowly putting these pieces together. How do we make it into a coherent long-term system?
And you and I talked about this 4 years ago, and so we won't do a 30-minute discussion of basic income. But it sounds to me like we got, this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing, and they all sort of work in certain different pieces. From an efficiency point of view, why don't we just make it one thing? Now, there are two big objections to basic income. One of them is it costs a lot of money, and the other one is it's basic. So some people need a bit more, some people need a bit less. Basic income is basic. It's the same number for everybody, kind of like CERB was. CERB was the same number for everybody. You either qualified for it or you didn't. Do you think the whole pandemic will, and again, I'm not going to ask you for your opinion on that because we talked about it 4 years ago and you've written extensively on it. My question is, do you think what we have experienced in 2020 will push the government towards a basic income style system, kind of like a permanent CERB?
I think that we're moving towards that for people who are working. And so that's the big difference here. This is, one of the reasons why people are poor is because they're not working for a variety of reasons. You think of disability as one of the primary reasons why people receive social assistance. And that's in large part means they can't work or employers are not willing to give them a shot to work. And so if you are working or have some attachment to the labor force, these programs can be very helpful. And I think the $500 floor that's now in place on EI, the $500 amounts for the CRB, I think starts to set a standard of $500 a week for people who are working and who have lost employment for some reason. So we're still working out the details of, say you're working a little bit, how much support should you get, self-employed versus working while on claim on EI, those still aren't equivalent. But those programs I think are being worked out. And so I think that this starts to support people who have, who have attachment to the labor force. And I think that's positive. It starts to set a bit of a floor for those folks. And so that's the issue of whether we can make this permanent over the long term. I mean, the benefit of the EI system and the CR programs is that they respond quickly. One of the downsides of using the tax system to distribute a basic income is that it responds slowly. And so, if you lose all your income and you might get the Canada Child Benefit, which is an important support for low-income families with children, you're not going to get it for a year because you got to wait for the income to drop. You got to wait to apply for your tax. It takes a long time. And so I think we want to start now thinking about basic income for working-aged adults without children. This is the key group that really receives no basic supports in Canada. Seniors have got old age security and the guaranteed income supplement. Families with children have the Canada Child Benefit, which is an important support for them. But the group that we're really missing in terms of like trying to set a floor on their earnings, a floor on the amount of income that they see, is working age adults. These new programs address to some degree working age adults who are employed or had some employment. What we really need is a program for working aged adults who are not employed and not attached to the labor force. And frankly, most of those folks are in social assistance presently. And so I think there's a real case, and those amounts are quite low. They're substantially lower than EI or the CRB program. They're provincial, so they vary a lot depending on which province you're in. They're far more generous in some provinces than others. And so I think there's a real case for the federal government potentially getting involved in social assistance and potentially making it more expansive, therefore helping more people who are in that category. But that, I think, is a missing piece, and none of these programs address that. I mean, for most provinces, well, it depends on the province, but half the provinces are clawing this back dollar for dollar. So every dollar you get on CERB, social assistance is reduced by exactly that amount. And so there's no incentive for you to apply for these programs, even if you're eligible. And so, I think there's a lot more to be done on that front when it comes to a basic income.
And the obvious question, though, is can we afford all this? So if we do end up with some kind of basic income, and you're right, there are working people adults who aren't quite, aren't able to do it. They aren't making enough. This is, a number of my clients, obviously. But we all know that the federal deficit this year is going to be, $400 billion or whatever it's going to be. And that's 1 year. At some point, do we have to say, wait a minute, we can't afford this. We're burdening future generations. How do you address the cost side of this?
I mean, the federal deficit is a reaction to what would have been a household deficit. So we can move deficits around. I mean, deficits don't happen in the abstract. Deficit is one side of the ledger, which created a surplus someplace else. If there's a deficit on the government side, there's a surplus in some other sector of the economy. It's just, if I give you $10, I'm a deficit at $10 and you're in a surplus at $10. It's really straightforward like that. And so the question is, a federal deficit created a surplus where in the economy? If it created a surplus for trade, for instance, which is to say we just bought a whole bunch of stuff from some other country, then that's a real waste of a federal surplus, of a federal deficit. But if it created a surplus in the household sector, we in essence moved the deficit around. We moved it from where it would have been, which is the household sector, because people would have run massive deficits in that they didn't have money coming in, but they did have to spend money on things like, rent and food and so on. They would have run up credit cards and so on to a much bigger degree. And so in essence, what happens is we shifted the deficit. That deficit would have absolutely happened, irrespective. We shut down the economy. Big sectors of the economy remain closed or certainly well below capacity. And so we've moved that deficit from the household sector to the federal government sector. And it's actually pretty clean. It's a pretty clean. I mean, there hasn't been a lot of loss to the corporate side. For instance, there hasn't been a big change in imports, exports. There hasn't been actually a big benefit on the provincial or municipal government side either. It's been almost entirely a transfer from the federal government to households, which in some degree is what you'd expect given that CERB and the wage subsidy are most of what's causing the deficit. So the question going forward, I think, is what proportion of our economy is going to continue to stay shut down? And so the federal deficit, we often think of that in economic terms, and I suppose, that there is economic impact. But this is as much a public health question as it is about, what these programs are like. They're purely reacting to the fact that people are unemployed. If we went back to 4% unemployment, well, the cost of these programs would quickly go to very small amounts. It'd be very manageable. The other point is worth pointing out is the federal government has never paid this little interest. Like they've never paid this little. We're now in the neighborhood on the shorter term bonds where investors are willing to lose money on an inflation adjusted basis to lend the federal government money. I mean, let's take them up on that offer. If you're a bondholder, you want to loan to the federal government and make less than what you gave them in loan 5 years from now, great. Like I'll take you up on that offer. And so I'm not terribly concerned about it at this point. I mean, what we really need to do is we need to make sure that people aren't permanently scarred by this in terms of, burning through assets, ending up on social assistance, which is absolutely what can happen when you don't have income coming in. You work in a sector that no longer can employ you. We need to take out loans at below the rate of inflation to do that. And that I think is my primary concern at this point.
Well, and again, we could discuss that for hours and hours and hours, but 4 years from now, I'll have you back on again, and we'll continue the conversation. So, thank you very much for being here. How can people find out, what you're up to? How can people follow the work of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives? What's the best way for people to track you down?
Yeah, certainly our analysis site where we're putting all this sort of rapid response, looking at who's going where and how much people will get. Behindthenumbers.ca is where that's going up. So I've got, a series of posts on that about where people are going in the analysis and who's going where on CERB. And then we've got a website, policyalternatives.ca, where we put some of the longer reports. But you can also follow me on Twitter. It's David Mac CDN. Where I've also got, charts and details there that link back to the analysis that I'm putting up.
Fantastic. Well, I will put links to all of that in the show notes on YouTube. And again, I think it's great to see all the numbers because that's a big part of what you're doing. Putting up numbers, people can look at them, they can make decisions for themselves. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. David, thanks very much for being here.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So what's my take on all this? Well, what will all of these changes mean for Canadians and their budgets and their debt levels? Well, as David mentioned, all of these benefits are taxable and will have taxes withheld before they send you the money. So many Canadians transitioning from CERB to one of the new benefits will experience an immediate drop in their cash flow. Employment is still fragile, so going back to work is not an option for many. The good news is if you have debt, but you aren't working, well, you don't have wages that can be garnished, but that's, of course, small consolation. If you aren't able to work, times are tough, and as David said, the government programs are, at best, only a partial solution. And there's another problem. Deferral periods are now coming to an end, so the cash flow they saved by not having to service their debts will now start going to debt repayment, and that's going to be another strain on people's cash flow. How will that impact Canadians with debt? Well, that's a whole other topic. So next week, I'll get Ted Michaelis back on the show to discuss deferral periods and some practical tips for negotiating with creditors as the deferred periods end. I'm going to put links to everything we talked about in the show notes. I'll put a link to my show on modern monetary theory, which was what David was kind of alluding to at the end there. So all those links are there, including everything David talked about. That's our show for today. Thanks for listening and watching on YouTube. Until next week when Ted Michaelis returns to discuss dealing with creditors and deferrals, I'm Doug Hoyes. Thanks for listening. That was Debt Free in 30.